I'm going to start admitting people in. Louis, we can start whenever you're ready.
Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Behavioural Science Club. You are all very welcome as you join us signing in. And this week, we are delighted to welcome back a previous guest, Jez Groom, who joined us right at the start of Behavioural Science Club when he spoke about his book. And we had a great chat that time. And Jez is joined by Pavan Mamidi. Pavan Mamidi is Director of Centre for Social and Behavioural Change at Ashoka University in Delhi. For those of you who don't know Jez, he started the Behavioural Science unit with Rory Sutherland in Ogilvy, and right at the start when Nudge Dots first kicked off, and he now has his own consulting firm, Cowry Consulting. And today we are looking forward to some lively conversation between Jez and Pavan, moderated by Prakash. And we're going to be talking about all things behavioural science. We're going to be talking about some areas that some of you might think are a little bit controversial. We don't know. But I'm going to hand straight over now to Prakash to moderate today's conversation. And we'd love all of your comments as it goes on, as usual, in the chat box. Thanks, Prakash.
Thank you so much, Louise, for people who have joined in from different corners of the world. Good afternoon, good evening, good night. If it is too late, good morning. Appreciate you all taking this time joining us today, especially the topic today is very interesting. Louise, please help me with letting the people in into the room from the waiting room. So a small context before we start the discussion today. Some of you may know this particular chart, or you may not know. These are, if I remember correct, the chapters of Thinking Fast and Slow, the different kind of experiments which are there, and where do they score on the replication index, compiled by some gentleman. I don't remember the source. I'll try to find and share with you all later down the line. The point being, overall replication is less than 50%. This is information which we've been floating around in the behavioral science world the last couple of months and weeks. And along with that, there has been a couple of discussions around Daniel Kahneman and his work, Thinking Fast and Slow. So that's number one. Number two have been articles which have very provoking headlines like The Death of Behavioral Economics. That's number two. And number three has been a recent news which broke out around one of the most famous, well-known figures in the world of behavioral science, Dan Ariely, right? So there are well, how do I put this? One way to infer whatever has happened is to say there might have been some sort of fraud. It does look like there was some tampering, but the question is what exactly happened and who is responsible. And that is the part where we do not have a clear proof, but we have a lot of speculations. But what has happened is, with all of the larger context, there have been a good amount of conversation and points and counterpoints, and it felt right, because this is a field we all love. It felt right to sit down here and have this discussion among us. And what better way than to have two fantastic minds out here. So I'm going to invite in Jez to start with, and then I'm going to invite in Pavan in a moment to join, right? So this is a larger context around which we have today's session. As usual, please feel free to put your cameras on, meet new friends, exchange your LinkedIn, Twitter, phone numbers, make new connects, and keep the chat lively, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, right? Jez, please, I want to first bring you over in here, and then I'm going to ask you to just set up a small context for us about what's going on.
So thank you very much for that, Prakash. And yeah, I mean, there's a few things which I can comment on, and then I'm sure Pavan will be able to comment on other things far better than I. And suppose the first thing would be one of my kind of observations about the field is that it is a human-based science, and it's a biological one. And I think that is interesting because unlike a lot of other behavioral scientists who are psychologists or economists that have retrained as behavioral scientists, I actually studied like biochemistry. And as you mentioned earlier, Louise, I work with Rory, and you know, there's some amazing stories that Rory has, but some real nuggets that I've really sort of taken on board. And one of them was he sort of explains that sort of economics has kind of cheated the system. And he sort of says that, you know, you've got mathematics as kind of a core scientific discipline. And then physics sits on top of mathematics, and chemistry sits on top of physics, and then biology fits on top of chemistry, and then psychology fits on top of biology. And economics actually does sit on top of psychology because it's, you know, essentially it's the implications of humans interacting with each other and making, you know, judgments and decisions. But what he said was that interestingly, economics sort of lifted itself up, put it all the way back down, and then put it somewhere between sort of physics and maths. And I think one of the interesting sort of themes, I think, of this debate is how mathematics, which I love, I'm not particularly good at it, so I'm kind of like a college level mathematician. Like I've got a really strong team that are very, very good on the quant. And but what's really, really interesting is that increasingly we're being able to explain the world through mathematics. And I remember being in behavioral science at the early days, and I got really, really fascinated by agent-based modeling to describe quite simple behaviors. You know, so it was explained to me kind of the algorithm that explains why geese can fly in a perfect V through some simple agent-based modeling. And I've kept that going. So I've always worked with people that are interested in that. So trying to explain the world through creative mathematics is something that I fundamentally believe in. However, what I think is happening is that the algorithms and the processing power that we have still isn't, I believe, complex enough and doesn't have the power enough to explain human behavior because it is too complex. There are too many variables. And it's my belief that we're at the start of that journey where a lot of the things that we see in experiments, they may well be the random outlier, that 5% that is the outlier that isn't true. But some of them might not be as kind of repeatable, if you like, because essentially there are other factors and we can't measure for those factors or control for those factors, but they do have an effect. And going back to why I think biological thinking is quite different from engineering and mathematical thinking, is small things can have huge effects, and have an appreciation of that. There may well be some factors in some of these replication of studies, not all, but some, where actually there are factors which are quite small that we can't detect that are having an influence on whether the behavior exhibited or not. So I think where I am is I don't believe there is a crisis. I think there's a massive opportunity. And I really, really want to welcome in strong quant into those studies. But I want to make sure that that quant is there to essentially open up the world of opportunities rather than close it down. And I think that's the big opportunity. So, you know, one of the things that I think we talk about a lot is context. And it seems to be we don't understand it enough. So for me, I would say there isn't a replication crisis. There's a context opportunity. So let's understand things that we don't understand a lot more. So I think, and that's kind of like, I suppose, where I see the world of behavioral science. It's a really, really exciting place to be. It's, as you said, Prakash, at the early stages, and there's a massive of opportunity, I think, for mathematicians and I think people that understand biology and a biological world better to come together. And it feels at the moment there's a little bit of a battle between the two, that, you know, there's mathematical processing power that says this didn't work, and there isn't actually the biological explanation of why that might be the case yet. So the mathematics wins, and I'm not so sure that's completely right. So you know, I'm incredibly positive. I'm optimistic. I'm biased. You know, I've dedicated the last 12 years of my life to this. I've given up highly paid jobs in advertising to this. I've got convinced my wife to essentially go on that journey with me, with my family. So of course I've invested. Of course I'm biased, but hopefully, you know, I'm not too old. But I'm sensible enough to essentially acknowledge that. And actually bringing other people into the debate and having that conversation and being less sensationalist about it and more realist about it, I think is going to help us progress. And then the final thing, and I'm hold over to Pavan, is to say that in true style, I think the people that are generating the debate, it feels like they've got an agenda to promote themselves, and doing that, I think, through sensationalizing with clickbait headlines. And I don't think that's professional, or mature or helpful to the body of work. And I'm happy to say that. You know, I think saying stop reading, thinking fast and slow, I think is something which I wouldn't vindicate at all. For sure, there may be some studies, and quite a lot of them in some chapters, that aren't easy to replicate. Does that mean that they're wrong? I'm not so sure. I'd like to do more work to try and find out. So that's kind of, I suppose, my opening sort of maybe more optimistic biased view, but hopefully quite pragmatic, simple, and understandable, and maybe a little bit less sensationalist to drive an agenda and ego.
Thank you, Jez. This is a lovely way to start, right? Before I go further, I want to say thank you to people who have just joined in right now. I've also put down some 5 links out there for people, so that people who are very curious, you can go through them. It'll give you a larger context. One of them is a post by Alina Haloni, went viral. It's around, it's a review, or not a review. It's a point of view on, I think, Noise, the book, and then her issues with the replication crisis. She writes beautiful about it. Second link is an article going viral right now. It's an old article, but it's viral again right now. Death of Behavioral Economics by Jason Reha, I think. Link number 3 is a rebuttal of Jason Reha's article saying, here is why you might be wrong. Link 4 is very interesting, folks. It talks about what is real, what is unreal, what we know, what we don't know. I think it's a New York Times article. It talks about how much of, like, when you say memory, is it memory? It's observing. When is the line blurring? How much do we know about how the brain works? And in the larger context, I think it's a beautiful link to read. The last of it, link number 5, is the scandal around Dan Ariely's situation and work around that, right? So please feel to go through them. People who have joined right now and who don't have those links, feel free to request someone to share this with you in the chat box. I want to quickly invite in Pavan here for a larger context. Pavan, now we both are from India. And one of the most amazing things about growing up in India is we are all aware of this whole fascination we have with the Vashikaran mantra. It has been a part of our culture around myths. And for people who are not aware of it, people from outside the country, Vashikaran is the ability to influence and control a person, right? So it is something that we Indians, housewives, lovers, job seekers, people are looking to get ahead in life. It's a magic talisman, a mantra that we have been searching for. And so there are there's gurujis and big people who can promise you Vashikaran, the ability to control people's behavior. So it is established that there's a desire to influence people's behavior, right? But if you go the step -1, which is, what is the step before you control people? You need to be able to understand it, people's behavior. And in this context, I want to talk to you, Pavan. You work with India and population of India with CSBC, and you understand how diverse we are. So in that sense, one can argue it's a small representation of humanity with all its complexities, so many languages, so many cultures, so many colors that we have among ourselves, right? So going back then becomes, yes, there is an obsession with trying to get people to, to control people, or a better way is to get people to do something in a certain way. Is it implied in this desire that everybody behaves the same way, and hence behavior can be cracked? And if that is the case, I think it becomes legitimate to be upset that something is not replicating because your formula did not work. I was told it will work. So let's start with the Pavan. This desire to say, or this way of saying, you know what, everything must replicate because we must be able to crack the human behavior for everyone. Yeah. What do you think about that?
No, great questions, Prakash, and Jez, thanks for setting that terrific context. To begin with, Jez has identified 2 very distinct categories of science, which I think is very important. One is, he referred to mathematics as being a systematic pursuit of universal truths and so on. And on the other hand, you have scientific endeavors which seek to uncover the particular, such as the sociological, for instance. And social sciences is also divided in the same way. And I wish to connect it with what you're talking about, Prakash. And so economics has systematically tried to tease out those universal principles of human behavior. And to what extent it has done that is of course, how successful it has been is a different question. But and this is where the empirical movement, which came in and challenged the neoclassical approach to mathematically interpret human behavior, sort of became the basis for the behavioral revolution. Now, connecting this discussion, this sort of binary, with what you're saying, Prakash, is the following. India indeed is a continent. It's not merely a country, and there's infinite variation. Whether you talk about ethnicity, whether you talk about religion, whether you talk about caste, we're divided in a million different ways, linguistically and so on. And all these covariates are likely to interact with the particular cause that you're trying to study and have and produce a variation in the type of effect that you're going to try and measure, right? That's fairly evident to be taken for granted. However, we also ignore the fact that as human beings, there's a lot that is common between us, and we tend to sort of amplify the differences rather than look at what is common. And that commonality can then become a basis to evolve policies, to evolve interventions, which can be really, really useful in changing behavior. And in changing behavior, I don't mean it in a sort of a Draconian, sort of a tyrannical sense, but I mean changing behavior to improve the lives of people. I mean, you want people to stop smoking. You want little children to have nutrition, right? You want lesser violence against women and so on. So to pursue these fairly agreeable ends, we can potentially explore the commonality in the behavioral attributes of individuals in this really diverse country, and then see how we can leverage that. So that's the sort of the first thesis that I would like to propose. In terms of the sort of the Dan Ariely replication phenomena that we are witness to, I completely agree with Jez. I think there is a bit of sensationalism, and we are trying to sort of diss behavior science. This is not a problem just with behavior science. It's a problem with science in general, and the way incentives are structured in the academic world. The academic world runs on a fuel not of money. People are really smart. They do their PhDs, and they deliberately inflict the poverty of tenure track jobs at universities, which don't pay all that very well. And why do they do it? They do it because of peer group notoriety. They do it for reputational benefits, right? They want to be known as the cool people, right? And the pursuit of the cool, I think, is the basic problem here, right? Pursuing cool. Would you rather have boring but effective solutions, or would you rather have cool but not so effective solutions in this world, right? Academics are incentivized to pursue the cool, the entertaining. And when academics start pursuing they want to become entertainers, that's where science gets compromised. And this is not just behavior science. I mean, political science has had this problem. It's called the Lacour affair that happened a few years ago. Same thing. So it's not behavior science. Replication is not a behavior. It's not a uniquely behavior science problem. It's a problem in physics as well. It's just that gravity replicates much more easily across the entire world than to certain types of behavior that you don't see it all that very much, right? Let me sort of end this introductory piece by suggesting two alternate ways in which one can sort of evaluate this Dan Ariely affair. One is a pathway to believing that, yes, there was fraud on, in the data and so on and so forth, which if in fact is the case, then it's a deplorable state of affairs. It's an outcome of these set of incentives in the academic world. The other option is, the other way of interpreting it is, the data is right? But it is a particular set of data. It's not generalizable. And in that particular experiment that they ran, maybe those were really the results. We don't know. But the problem there is, from the non-replicated set of particular data to generalize and say that this is science is a problem. Right? So there are problems in either way of interpretation. If there's fraud, then that is a problem of incentives in the academic world. And if there is particularity, and from that particularity, people are being ambitious and overstating the truth that this is science, then there's a problem. So the first one is a problem of ethics, and the second one is a problem of philosophy of science. Let me pause there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Pavan, I couldn't echo that more. And that's kind of was my kind of what stimulated to write the pieces that I did, was to say that I believe there's a strong foundation in quite boring behavioral science principles that work in repeatable fashion. So I think defaults work particularly well, as we know, as long as they're managed with a really, really good choice architecture to let people choose otherwise. So they're not forced down a path. They're given a preferred path, which is why they've come. But if they want to choose something different, that's great too. Things like saliency, making it pretty clear, like what people are expected to do. So walk down this corridor or click on this button. These are quite simple things. They don't win you awards. They don't win you, business, in terms of the idea. But what they do is they change behavior. So one of my kind of I suppose more experienced learnings was the codex of biases that is doing the rounds is, for me, it's ridiculous. There's a long tail of esoteric biases that are sensationalized in exactly the way you described. And whilst it's nice to have a list that long, actually, if you know anything about behavioral science, having a long list is maybe not a good idea. So I'm really sort of conscious to say that in my experience working with businesses, not in the academic world as yourselves and the development world, is you can utilize these principles, which have been there for quite a long time. We've now codified them. We now understand the why as well as the outcome. And you can use them to design experiences to make the world better in a repeatable fashion. And I think that seems to be where I'd like to land the debate, is to say, I wholeheartely agree with the naysayers to say that there are some studies which sound too good to be true. And I think some of them are too good to be true. They're essentially on a low sample size. No one's been able to replicate them. I doubt they will. But there are some studies in between that maybe the context is really relevant. And then there's some strong evidence to say that I think there's around about 10 to 12 really, really repeatable behavioral science principles. The second thing that I've learned is, over the sort of the 12 years of doing this, is, as ever with a new innovation, the people that are involved in the very early days are very excited about it, and they do sensationalize it. And I do feel that behavioral science got some things brilliantly right. So Thaler and Sunstein talking about behavioral economics and reframing psychology as maybe a harder quantitative sort of business type, or behavior take was a genius. I think the editorial team that changed libertarian paternalism as a title to nudge was a stroke of genius. And the fact that it came at a time when the world was suffering from a huge economic crisis and needed low-cost solutions was a brilliant sort of point in history. One of the things I think we got wrong was essentially, going back to what you say, Pavan, was essentially about the mosaic and I suppose the differences in the world, is we talked about it as a predictable, systematic, hardwired, homogeneous set of principles. Essentially, we had the tools to essentially change behavior, whether people liked it or not. And now, if you've seen the recent kind of sort of cut that's circulating around Professor Thaler talking around how nudge theory was positioned, I think maybe the media, maybe some scientists, but maybe not the originators, said, nudge theory in isolation isn't going to solve the world's problems. There's some problems that are unsolvable with nudge theory and behavioral science that do require some of the tools that we've used in policy and business over a long time. And so I think where I am is, I think I said it is, I think behavioral science can give us really, really good incremental gains. And actually, when you design ecosystems with these principles in mind, those gains all aggregate to actually better behavioral environments, and you can get 10, 20 or 30% shifts in behavior at relatively low costs compared to maybe infrastructural IT sort of builds. The transformational, sensational, the 80s, the 90s, the 100s, they do come, that they are open to question, but it's not something that I think we should be talking about. So you know, I think when we look back now, saying, you know, if you think about we're predictably irrational, you know, I think that's maybe an overclaim. You know, I think, you know, I totally agree. I don't think a lot of the behaviors we exhibit are irrational. They're non-rational. They're evolutionary, psychologically sane. They make complete sense to me. And then, you know, I think the predictable, that they're not predictable all of the time. We need to understand sort of context, I think, a lot more. There's one word that I think from biology, so from my biochemistry days, is homogeneous and heterogeneous. And one of the things that, again, I'm learning is to say that heterogeneity in behavioral science interventions is critical to drive scale. So to think that, you know, one single small change in an environment is going to massively push the dial, I think is an overclaim now. That, you know, it's very, very rare. I think actually, going back to what you're saying, Pavan, is to say less sensational, more boring, but actually repeatable, is to say, here are some really strong principles. Let's experiment with them. Let's look for a 10 or a 20 or 30% gain. And let's see if we can repeat that when we start to scale up these solutions with more heterogeneity in terms of the way that that is executed. And that seems to be where I'd like to I suppose, take the direction of my team in, which essentially is thinking in those terms, as opposed to there's some esoteric principles that we can't replicate around, you know, mentioning slow words and expecting people to walk slowly. Well, okay, fine. You know, that is esoteric. Actually, let's focus on the stuff that really, really does work. And let's build, you know, some form of community around that, and let's build some work around that, and let's learn. And so, yeah, I think, you know, heterogeneity in behavioral science is increasingly a theme which is going to surface, I think.
Let me jump in here with a quick question then. We talked about this whole codex, which is quite popular. You know, it is one of those things that you can share and give your friends, and whenever someone sees it for the first time, the mind is always blown. You know, and it seemed like there in the chakra almost lies the answer to understanding human behavior. Then I go back to what both of you have said, which is around focus on just the core. There might be 200 plus other biases, which may or may not be exciting or boring or replicate or may not. But the basics, if you focus on them, you might be able to find a solution. It may not get you awards. It might be super boring, but it'll work. Can we quickly talk about one or two of these solutions or projects that Pavan, you and Jez have executed with CSBC or with Cowry, you know, which has kind of you know, solve problems on ground?
Jez, you should go first.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that we have done at Cowry, which it's a very early stage, is we've got over 50 case studies now. And what we've identified is in the current state, so the pre-state in a legacy environment, we've identified what we think the psychological behavioral science principles are that are getting in the way, that the barriers and inhibiting the behavior. So it might be there's too much information, cognitive overload, or it might be there's no demonstration that people are actually exhibiting this behavior. It might be a social proof. And then what we've then done is essentially look to see how we've solved that. You know, not saying we're solving everything brilliantly, but what we've done. And then we've looked at what psychological principles were involved in solving that problem. And then we've then looked at the outcome in terms of a very simple scale, which I know the predictive analytics and machine learning guys like, which is essentially a 0, 1, 2, and a 3. So quite a simple kind of valence of effect. And what we've started to understand is that that things like commitment, getting people to publicly say, you know, that this is a good thing, or take them along with you in chunked up steps, where you're making it clear what is required of them, seems to work. You know, so you know, all too often I think in behavior change, like we've got this really, really difficult thing and we need to solve it with this really, really sort of crazy solution. And actually, no, it's just maybe saying to someone, this is the ultimate sort of goal. These are the steps towards that goal. Let's start off with something quite simple, and other people are doing this. Would that be a good idea? So things like commitment, cognitive overload, and chunking, social proof, social norms, saliency. And what we're finding is, if you're having a conversation with someone, that's a really, really helpful tool and guide. So, we do a lot of work in contact centers where how many of you have rang a contact center up and you just don't know how long the call's going to be, where the call's going to go, whether, you understand the process. It's just really, really tough. So you get annoyed, and it doesn't make for a good interaction. So a lot of the work we do is essentially designing conversations with the way that the brain likes to have conversations, without using snake oil to guide people into things that they don't want. One of my favorite ones was some of these calls go on for quite a long time, and we had kind of an older vulnerable customer group, and what we noticed was around about 40 minutes the customer started to be very kind of agitated and make quicker decisions. And what we found was that actually that they wanted to go to the bathroom, and they were too embarrassed to say to the person on the call, can I go to the bathroom? So essentially, when you get to the 40-minute point, if you say this, at this point, some of our customers like to take a comfort break and go to the bathroom. I've got to do some administration on the call that we've just been doing. If you'd like to take the opportunity, that would be great. And essentially, just that human understanding essentially means that, the desperate need to go to the toilet doesn't mean that people are going to make poor financial decisions. So yeah, and all this is empirically based. So, I'm very, very fortunate to have a team far cleverer, better than I, that are doing strong ethical experimental design, good data integrity, and designing experiments in a business setting that aren't randomized controlled trials, to try and get to that good outcome. And we've got them all on the website. So, I'm quite happy to talk about sort of all of those in terms of kind of what those outcomes might be. But in terms of kind of winning awards, the ironic thing is that there's usually kind of two types of awards given. One is the idea, sensationalist, interesting, creative, but the other one is an outcome. And we win a lot of awards on, I think, quite strong, robust behavioral science, which isn't actually super creative, but actually when you look at the outcome and how it's improving people's lives in terms of decision making around financial services, utilities, making good decisions about retail, then that's when it looks out. You sort of go, okay, this seems to be working pretty well, and at a relatively low cost compared to other decisions that they've got to make. So yeah, and one of the things, and I'll finish on this, Pavan, and hand over to you. But one of the things that I kind of wrote about would be to say that obviously you've got peer review within academic world, which I've never experienced, which I imagine would be extremely daunting. But what I have found is in organizations, in businesses, if it isn't working, they're not going to buy it again. So they're not going to drink the Kool-Aid year after year after year going, God, this stuff's so good, but actually our business metrics aren't changing. And that's what I'm finding is different sectors, and over time with different clients, we've got clients who've been working for 6 years, they continue to reinvest because there is consensus in the business that this is having a positive effect. And I think, that's a different check and balance, I think, about whether behavioral science is working or not. It might not be as clear and pure as an academic study around one principle. It might be a combination of principles and we can't disentangle them. But what we do know and what we're finding is that it makes the experience better and you lead to a better outcome and behavior changes as a result. So I think that's kind of, I suppose, some of the learnings that I've had, which kind of echo, I think, Pavan, some of the things that you were saying.
No, Jez, I really appreciate the point that you made about how there is a certain kind of a discipline that you experience on account of being in the private sector. The market is really the thing that demands delivery of outcomes rather than the coolness of the intervention and so on. And that keeps your projects grounded. It's based on outcomes, and you've got to change lives that way, right? In our case, we found that some of the interventions that we have developed have tended to be rather prosaic. I mean, not so clever, perhaps, but but we are encouraged by the fact that the outcomes have been, some of the outcomes that we have been experimenting with have been really profound. One example that comes to my mind is we ran a couple of these experiments. Our problem statement was to increase complementary feeding for little children. You know, there's a child nutrition in the country is very, very low, and you know, kids don't get, especially between the ages of 6 months and 23 months, they don't get diverse foods, they don't get sufficient food, and so on. And the problem statement for us is simply to increase the child nutrition. And one of the methods that we thought that we could use, and which we tested, was to bring parents of little kids into WhatsApp groups. Nothing profound there, and have a sort of an enumerator, somebody who manages the group, convey the message through these WhatsApp groups. And we found that you know, we had a 60% increase in the willingness of people to increase diet diversity for the little kids, or increase the meal frequency for the little kids, and so on. So nothing spectacular by way of intervention. It's fairly prosaic, but in terms of what it can do in solving a really deeply entrenched social problem is profound, and that gives us the satisfaction much more than the coolness of the intervention. And similarly, we met with some success, for instance, in addressing this is a project that has also been scaled up by a government in Madhya Pradesh, and this relates to getting pregnant women to remember to take iron pills. You know, you lead a tough life, and you're likely to forget taking the pills, and you got to do this over 180 days. So my team and some of my colleagues, they designed this calendar, you know, with a little scratch off section where, you know, it reveals the picture of a pretty baby, right? And that becomes sort of a micro incentive for a person to sort of do it repeatedly on a daily basis. So it's a goal tracking kind of a mechanism. And that produced some really encouraging results as well, right? So one of the, this leads me to one important point, and that is, we don't necessarily restrict ourselves to the domain of nudges. You know, behavior science is a bit of a composite term, and it encompasses not merely nudges or behavioral economics, the way it is conceived of in terms of biases and so on, right? I mean, loss aversion. The domain of social norms is a very powerful, it provides us a very powerful toolkit to change behavior. And social norms traditionally is not behavioral economics, because it's all about informal institutions which impose expected costs on prescribed behavior, right? It's you know, social norms are more similar to formal laws than they are to traditional nudges. But social norms are very, very powerful instruments of change. So we also feel, so we have the license to traverse across disciplinary boundaries within behavior science and take whatever that can potentially work in solving problems. So we're not purists in the sense that we're just nudge theory or choice architecture, but anything that works, even if it's fixing a law. And laws are not traditionally the subject matter of behavior science. These are formal institutions. The biggest instrument of change of behavior in society is law. It's not behavior science. It's not nudges. You know? So
is it worth? I mean, I've seen some stuff on the chat, because I think, you know, there's some discussion, I think, around Dan Ariely and the fraud element, you know, and this might be wrong, so people might have really, really gone down rabbit holes. But when I've read through kind of like the more formal kind of apologies, the PDFs that were attached from Dan and Nina, etc. From what I understand, is Dan's taken responsibility as essentially being the person that liaised with the insurance company, and that wasn't the rest of the team. And he, you know, accepted a data set and then did some analysis on that data set, and the due diligence that he placed on that wasn't up to the standards that would be expected. I think he's kind of acknowledged that, and he's taken a learning from that. I think the question went around fraud. again, this might be my understanding, which might be wrong, but as I understand it, is that the data set had two different fonts, and there was some randomization of data, which was fake data within it, which didn't subscribe to the traditional bell curve, and that was done by the insurance company. And that's my interpretation. Might be wrong, but I think that's what's happened. So I think to say that Dan Ariely is fraudulent, I'm just not. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that a data set was provided to him, and he wasn't showing scientific due diligence on that, and he's acknowledged that, and he's learned from that. I think the clickbait around the professor that talked about honesty being dishonest, I think is just an easy, it's kind of clickbait, and we know what those things do, and they meet the agenda of certain things. And, I think that's certainly the case. Again, I wrote about this would be that I think obviously Dan Ariely's got a personal brand, and I think that is quite unique within the behavioral science world, I think. And he's created that. He does have more interesting ways of talking about behavioral science, I think, than maybe some of the others. But I just find it incredulous that Cass Sunstein, Kahneman, Cialdini, Ariely have all sat down on the East Coast of America and said, right, we're going to create a discipline which we think isn't true based on fraudulent findings for our own personal gain. I think that is incredulous that different people from different places are thinking and behaving in that way. And when you hear about, I think, some of the way in which they talk about their contribution to the world and the legacies they want to leave, and the way that they have demonstrated they've done it across their lives, for me, it feels like there isn't necessarily that agenda. For sure, I think in behavioral science, there has been some people, and in social sciences, that have manipulated or created fake data to, Pavan, do exactly what you described, to essentially get those peer reviews. I just don't believe that Ariely sits in that case, and I don't believe Kahneman or Cass or Richard Thaler. The interesting thing, I think, is they do challenge, actually, the mathematicians about why the world doesn't subscribe to pure mathematic theory, and that's been the cusp, and that's been I suppose, the real drive behind behavioral science, is to say the world isn't as easy to understand. It is more complex, and it isn't, the predictive analytics just don't do it right now. And I really sort of think that that's unfair, and I can only believe that people do it for personal gain, because maybe, as you say, Pavan, from a reputation perspective, or even from a financial perspective, people are unhappy they've got what they've got, and that's an opportunity to do it. So I might be proved wrong. It might be that Dan and the team have been fictitious. I personally, at this point in time, I might come to change my view, but that's where I stand right now.
Gentlemen, one quick question here, then, right? For hypothesis, for the sake of argument, let's assume that you can never replicate anything, because the minds are too different. You just can't know. More often than not, we are wrong. Right? Let's assume that is the situation for the sake of argument. Where does that leave us? And is there a way to, just by a thought experiment right here, disprove the whole premise, saying, there's no way of knowing or understand the human mind? Can that be a premise at all that we started? Because if we accept it, the entire thing is sorted. You just see, yes, there's no way you can understand it. There are no patterns. So there's no discussion. Let's go home, right? Enjoy our beers. So is there a way to disprove that just through a thought experiment? And number two, what does a world like that mean for us and our work?
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, go on, Jez.
Sorry, Pavan. Yeah, I mean, might answer the question directly, but I thought it was fascinating on the Stanford experiment on marshmallows, so 74, and delayed and instant gratification. And you read some sensationalism around that. It was the one test that's going to predict if your child is going to be successful or not, right? That was what it said. And then you read the Stanford study has been debunked. And again, sensationalist to say actually something we subscribe to is wrong. And then you read around that, and then actually I think it's quite sad, but it is part of the human condition that the sample size was disproportionately I suppose, representative of people from and children from affluent backgrounds. And the really, really sorry and sad state is that children from poor backgrounds are more likely to go for it because there is no guarantee that they're going to get food, right? And for me, around replication is to say that that is just a very, very, I think, a very sorry and sad way of bringing to life the fact that just looking at the mathematics around things actually isn't a good description of the human condition, that it is more complex and it is more visceral. And from an evolutionary psychological perspective, if you're a child that doesn't know when the next meal is coming, it makes complete sense to eat that marshmallow because that's what you've learned. And for me, that's where I think all the algorithms in the world that we've got right now aren't going to uncover those things just yet. And that's why I think the Stanford experiment is a really, really interesting way of trying to understand, I suppose, the human condition and why we do what we do, but only 30 or 40 years later. So I think that's certainly, I think, where my case. There's another thing, is listen to the chat about why would a company create the data? Why would they do that? I think nobody knows why they would do that. This is my personal hypothesis, based on that. Somebody in the data team most probably looked at it. They most probably thought, crikey, there's not enough data in here to give the professor enough information for him and his team to do the work. What I'm going to do is randomize, essentially, utilizing simple algorithms, a way of bulking up that data to make it good, just so it doesn't come back on me, because they might have said, yeah, the data's there, and they don't want to look bad within the organization. I've seen that happen all the time. Human error or human judgment at that sort of stage, that may well have happened. The other thing is that Dan Ariely was incredibly busy. He was overworked. The Coursera, I chatted to him about the Coursera. It was so successful. He had essentially thousands of people that wanted to talk to him directly. So that's why I had to stop doing it, because it gave him open access to him as an individual. He was overwhelmed with people trying to get hold of him because they're excited. So, I think it's a combination of human error on the data provision, that maybe it was the right thing to do in their mind. Now we know it's the wrong thing to do. And actually somebody that was just too busy and didn't follow the right process. And I think it's that simple. It's boring. We'd like to think that people are fraudulent and they want to make money from lemonade IPOs and create this thing, but I don't think it's the truth. I think it's more simple than that. There's a bit of, I think this is the right thing to do, and there's a bit of, I'm too busy. It doesn't make it right, but I think it's a more simple explanation and more believable in my mind as to what happens. So that's, again, some of you will disagree with you, some of you don't like me, but that's heterogeneity, so that's the world, right? So.
Just a quick comment, Jez and Prakash, and that. So this is coming from the fact that I teach research methods and quantitative research methods in PhD programs. So a lot of my thinking is based on that background. The first I think point to recognize is that the use of experiments in behavior science is a historical accident. It's not as if you need to only use behavioral experiments or you need to randomize to arrive at truths in science, right? So because psychologists use experiments in classrooms and with their students, that sort of got absorbed into the world of economics, and then that became sort of the basis to arrive at causal reasoning and so on, right? But there are alternate ways in which you can grapple with this heterogeneity that Jez is talking about, and one of which is you run surveys, you do observational methods, right? Or now with the advent of great processing capacity with artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can absorb the complexity of these large number of covariates in your data sets. And then that might actually give you a nice purchase of relationships between multiple variables and the variable of the outcome variable of interest, right? So I don't believe that we need to throw behavior science out because of the limitations of experiments. Experiments are tremendous, processes by which you can purchase internal validity. You wiggle one small thing and keep everything else constant, and then through the process of ceteris paribus, you measure the outcome variable. That's fine. That's great. But that's not necessarily the only way that you can test propositions. So if indeed the world is heterogeneous like India is, I mean, there are a million covariates flowing from different parts of the world, language, choices, preferences, and so on. And somehow your processing capacity can, absorb that variation and then still provide an explanatory framework. That's, that works for me.
Yeah, one of the things, Pavan, I mean, this is totally a little bit left field, but I was chatting to a friend who in the UK, a lot of people have been double vaccinated, and it's one of the dads in the football team, and he's not been vaccinated. He doesn't want to be vaccinated because he doesn't want to have it in his body, and actually, people telling him to have it in his body makes him react and say he doesn't want that. And in a kind of like a crazy kind of biological way, I kind of go, and like Nassim Taleb sort of also writes about these sort of things, is actually, that might be good for society, because if there are some people that haven't been vaccinated, and if on the off chance the vaccination does do something that's pretty bad, then I'm actually quite reassured that there is somebody in the human race that's going to continue, right? So it might be that 70-80% of us are all going to go in 20 years time when something happens, but there'll be some people that haven't, and that's good. So it might not necessarily help me in my life or my family because I advocate it, but it kind of makes sense, so that's, I don't know, I think where I am is to say that uniformity and homogeneous society I don't think is good. I think Nassim sort of Taleb, when he talks about things is when he looks at economies with linear growth, and environments with linear growth, ecosystems with linear growth, he thinks that there's something wrong, because at some point there's got to be some form of correction, because it's just going to get bigger. And I think, there's some interesting sort of, I suppose, things around, I suppose, this way that we position behavioral science is to say these are universal, hardwired, predictable, and systematic truths that work across everybody, and it's just not true. It's just not true. So I think that's certainly sort of where I sit. Again, I like the fact that people don't like me and don't like what I say and don't agree with me. And crikey, the world would be pretty boring if everyone did that. Right? So yeah, I think, but let's have the conversation, and let's have it in like this sort of conversation, which hopefully is kind of like, well, I don't know, maybe you're right, maybe I'm right. Let's figure it out and let's do some empirical work to try and figure out what's going on, as opposed to the world seems to be quite polarized and sensationalized, and I'm not so sure that's particularly progressive. Yeah.
Thank you. Fantastic conversation. I know we have around 5 minutes remaining, and I do want to bring in Konstantinos and Jafar for maybe 2 quick, short questions. I know you have a hard stop at 5:30 your time, 5 o'clock your time, Jez? Can you give us 5 minutes more? Nothing sucks than an abrupt closer, man. Right? A smooth, nice buy. So let's have 10 minutes. That'll be fun. Jafar, you had a couple of chats out there. Do you want to unmute and join me with a question? You're still here in the chat? All right, I think Jafar has just left the building.
No, hey Prakash, hi, sorry. Hey Jez, hi Pavan. I don't remember the question. I'm trying to scroll back and see what was it that I asked.
You were talking about a manual for the human. I really
got it. Yeah. So this came up when Pavan was talking about universal behaviors, right? So I was thinking the commonalities that triggered me, right? So commonalities can also manifest in different ways in different contexts, and the context could be a geography or even as internal as an emotion, right? That a universal behavior could also be come out as a very different behavior if my emotional state is different. So hence, even these commonalities could be malleable, right? And in that case, why do we believe these, academic studies upfront that much? I mean, it is not truth, right? I've been shouting it out in multiple platforms that do not take these scientific studies as truth, right? They're just signals to us. And that's why we do pilot studies and use data, right? And hence, I mean, if these universal behaviors were that pure that they could replicate everywhere, then there would be a manual for a human behavior, right? We don't have any such things. I mean, we only have like philosophy and stuff like that. That sort of scales a little bit, but yeah. But what are your thoughts on, that kind of limitation, and any notes for any young professionals, how they read behavioral sciences, scientific studies?
Jafar, great seeing you again. So I don't belong to that camp where I believe that you cannot generalize, at least in some small measure, right? I mean, the attempt to construct social science is not to just create a laundry list of particulars, sociological particulars. There's caste system here, or this, you make observations, right? That's not the point. The point is also to generalize, to build some amount of theory. I mean, even Esther and Abhijit, even though they have abandoned theory in great measure, attempt to produce some generalizability, and that is important. That's an important pursuit, if only to make it portable to a different context and then still apply it, right? I mean, arriving at generalizability is a way of economizing on your cognitive resources. Otherwise, you will have to start discovering the world in terms of every particular that you can encounter at every different point. And there's no potential for memory in the process of learning, and there's no potential to change the human world, right? Unless you repeat the pursuit or repeat the inquiry at every instance. Right? So I mean, so there are certain kernel generalizable features of human behavior. I do think that there are, but that is not to say that we dissolve particularity. So I mean, it's a tension between the sociological approach versus the economic approach. The economists have this physics envy. They want to they want to reduce everything to mathematics, and sociologists and anthropologists have this very dubious postmodern impulse to make everything relative and to make everything particular. I think the truth is somewhere in between. Yeah,
totally makes sense, Pavan. I mean, we wouldn't be here talking about behavioral sciences if there weren't so many communities to trust on, right? Definitely, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, Jafar, I mean, one of the things that, again, because I'm not a psychologist, but kind of a biochemist, that was like my kind of early academic, was I really fascinated. Like, there's a book called The Biological Mind, and it just talks about, we have, and I think it was featured in some of Prakash's kind of early kind of PR for the session around, we have this obsession that the mind is disassociated from the body and the mind is a computer. And that isn't true, right? The brain is not a computer. It's a biological organ, and it sits within a body, and it is a combination. So like, one of the things that I'm fascinated by would be like, it isn't just about neurons firing. It's about what other chemicals are going on in the brain, and what those neurotransmitters and hormones are. They're like really powerful things, and you can't switch off a hormone. Once it's in bloodstream, it doesn't go in an instant. And one of the things that I've kind of learned, which is displacement of an emotion from one environment to another. Like, I'm angry, and then I transport that to be angry somewhere else, or even worse is if you're really, really happy, and then you take that happy emotion into an environment where you should be more rational. We've all done it. We've had a great morning, brilliant, our football team's won, or the sun is shining, whatever it might be. You're just a nicer person, and you're more affable in your decision making. You just are, and I'm fascinated by that essentially looking at the mind as a biological organ within the body, as opposed to a computer which drives our body's behavior. I just don't think that's true. So I'm with both of you to go, I think there are some homogeneous generalizations which are modulated by the context, either personal, social, or environmental. And we just don't know enough yet. And that's what's so exciting. That's why I don't understand the agenda, which is let's try and kill behavioral science off because mathematically it doesn't replicate. It's like, of course, if you're an agenda, is you're a mathematician that's got an algorithm that disproves it, of course you're going to say that because you're biased. But they can't acknowledge that. It's like, I know I'm biased. I've got investment in this sector. Of course I have. But I'm not so sure the algorithmic writers do. They're just right because it's maths. So
thank you so much, guys. I want to quickly bring in Konstantinos. I hope I'm getting your name right. Please join us, unmute. You had a couple of questions, Konstantinos?
Yes, I have a question. I would like to bring us back a little bit back to the Ariely discussion, because I think that we should not leave it at what was last said, because the issue about the fonts and the two data sets that were practically the same is not the most important element of this data inquiry. I think that the most important and unambiguous data is the fact that the rounding distribution is homogeneous. And I think this is, we have to if we are going to discuss about this thing, we have to mention this and be honest, because my topic is on motivated beliefs, and I really want to believe that Ariely is not fraudulent in this case. I really want to do it, but homogeneous rounding in such a kind of data set is something that I cannot really even perceive as something that could happen. And I think that this is the most important point, and that we should address it. So if Jez would like to comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just sense that he didn't follow due diligence, and he's embarrassed about that. You know, so it undermines his ability to look at data, and understand what a data integrity set and its data set with integrity looks like, and one that doesn't. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether he doesn't have. I don't have the skills, and maybe it's yourself, and but I have a team that do. And whether he hasn't got the skills and didn't want to say that, or whether he just didn't follow the right steps. You know, I just, you know, that's my view, is that I know that, you know, going back to some of the conversation we're having before, is that, you know, when things are going really well, you don't question yourself. You know, you don't. You know, we've seen it with politicians, we've seen it with sports. People just do. You know, they go, "I'm great. Things are going well. I don't need to do that." And I genuinely believe that's what's happened, that I think he was too busy and didn't spend enough time looking at the finer detail, and he's embarrassed by that. And I don't know whether it's a skill set embarrassment or whether it's a time embarrassment. And but I don't believe it undermines behavioral science or some of the other work that he's done. I mean, a bit of the commentary around, I mean, the confirmation bias, I think, is just kind of strange. Is I've seen two people say two different things. One is to say he's colluding with Nina Mazar, and actually he's working with different people, so no one will work with him twice. And you kind of go, you can't have it both ways in your argument. Yeah, that, you know, he's colluding with one person and then he's working with lots of disparate people. I mean, come on, you're just essentially utilizing stuff, and this is the world. You know, this is people interpreting the world, and I just sometimes think the world's a bit more boring. And you know, I think maybe it's the case. I think, you know, I think there's two scientists which I'm not going to name, one which I didn't know about, and one that has been, you know, everlasting soup bowls. You know, I think there has been some hacking going on around some experimentation to sensationalize some of these findings, but I just don't think Dan's in that camp. It's just, he seems to say a lot of things that make complete sense. You know, this one was most probably on that more sensationalist side. You know, it's too good to be true, so therefore it's not true. You know, going back to what Pavan was saying, you know, if Dan Ariely kept putting out papers that said, if you chunk up information into easily digestible steps, demonstrate that other people do this behavior and it leads to a good outcome, but you can choose an alternative, and these are the steps that it's going to take, and it's going to take you half an hour, is that something that you would find preferable? That's just not very interesting for academics. So, you know, you're not going to further your reputational career, and it's not my world, but I can see why people would do that. So I don't know if that helps, Konstantinos. That's kind of my view. I mean, maybe I've not answered the question, but I think that's the case. I'd like to believe it's the case, based on, you know, from what I've seen sort of from that place. So yeah, I think there is a little bit of marketing spin in Ariely versus the other professors. I think there is. You know, I think, you know, there's some of that. But, yeah.
Thanks, Jez. I think we're also almost at the end of time. I know you have a hard deadline, but thank you. You stayed back for some time. Constantinos, I know it's your day one out here. Please keep on coming back. One of the most amazing thing about this field, fraternity, is I had no idea Constantinos existed before today. And I was trying to hijack a couple of popular posts, people who were talking about the replication crisis, because I wanted them to come down and have this discussion. And one, two people also told me, oh, you shameless guy, you're a pirate, you're hijacking stuff. I said, yes, I am, right? Again, behavioral science. I would rather admit my flaws right out there than be ashamed of it. And that's how I discovered Constantinos. And I'm glad he's here asking questions. And I'm sure he's going to come back. I can in fact see someone from possibly from Turkey too. I think, I saw someone out there, Nilo Dervish. Nilo, are you from Turkey by any chance? All right, I'm assuming. I could be wrong, but the fact is, it builds up a fantastic community. I committed fraud when I was in engineering college, and it was during my final semester. I'm supposed to give a report to my professor. I know engineering. I can solve projects, so I did nothing. I partied, and 2 days before the report, and engineering teaches you that. How do you do, one thing, everything in one day, right? That's what engineering courses in India are very good for. And so in case my teachers try to say, oh, let's cancel this degree, it's just a story I'm telling guys, so please do not cancel my degree. Now, with the disclaimer in place, I gave fraud data. When I gave it, I had a mean around which I concentrated mean around most of my data. I have some 4 or 5 readings on the edges, just because I want to make it look like it's a human error or a machine fault or something like that. And I sailed through. Now, I'm not as smart as Professor Ariely. It's really hard for me to believe, though, someone that intelligent would not think through all these tiny things. If he or she has to commit for anybody, so that there are simple things that you look for data. If you're trying to plagiarize someone's content, guys, this is not a suggestion, so don't take it the wrong way. But if someone's going to run a Grammarly check-in all on your PDF, one solution is paste whatever you have plagiarized as an image. The software can't read that, and your content is going to pass through. We all know hacks like that, right? So simply looking from this lens and then looking at saying, I think he plagiarized it. Maybe, like Divya pointed out some time back, there might be an element of schadenfreude out there, maybe. Again, I don't know. But people like Dan Ariely, people like Daniel Kahneman have been responsible beyond one experiment in one book. They have been responsible for firing up the imagination of an entire range of people, a lot of companies coming up, people trying to make change in the world. So there is a lot bigger contribution than writing a book or doing an experiment. So there is that larger point of view also that you can interpret people with. I think we should wrap up now. We will keep on talking. I'm going to have a quick summary of what you talked about. Pavan, you talked about the beauty of ethics versus philosophy. So you're going to have that as a guiding light for ourselves. Jez talked about focusing on the core and not getting carried away by the long tail of 2,000 or 200 biases that keep on coming up. Focus on the core work. We talked about transformational work versus incremental work, and how most of the time, while we might get blown away by the cool transformational work, it is the tiny, boring, incremental change for which you typically don't get awards. But that is what makes changes on the ground. We found out beautiful studies. We saw people chat about the weird sciences in the chat box, and also the acknowledgement that maybe we're in too big a rush to understand the human mind. I mean, from Newton to Einstein, there was a long chain, from your classical physics to say, maybe we can't really understand stuff on a quantum level. So there is that. Before I go, I want to quickly leave one thing about this beautiful field, which a lot of people say doesn't really work, is the field of marketing. It has been there, and half of the people say, I don't think it works, and the remaining says it works, and no one is able to pinpoint how it works. And you have like $100 billion industry built around marketing as a proper legit discipline. So maybe there is that to look up to and say, I think we should get inspired from there. As to the question of how do you criticize? I think that's a bigger, larger question. It's a question of philosophy. It's a question of how we look at the world. And I don't think I'm qualified to talk about that. So I'm gonna cede the stage back to Jez and Pavan for any parting last words for us, and then we will call it a night. Jez, back to you.
No, thank you for that summary. Yeah, I think yeah, the if we can just focus on the things that we know that are fairly, as Pavan said, more homogeneous, that we know work, and then work together to figure out how we then look at this modulation and more heterogeneity in a sensible fashion. I think this has grown up, you know, and do it in a way which is together. You know, there isn't the personal gain, you know, the pursuit that we're in is to essentially understand human behavior. It's not about driving YouTube views or clicks or peer reviews. Like start with the fundamental, like you want to leave the world better, like, and it'd be great to design a world that helps people live better lives. And that might sound a bit too much, but it's true. You know, if you start with that principle, then everything else is easy. You know, you know, it means that you do get a bit close to your aim, and that's what I'm really hoping for. That out of this debate, that the behavioral science community will say, yeah, for sure, there's people on the fringes that maybe want to throw stones. That's the same in most places in the world. But actually, if we can, I suppose, work together to essentially, as Jafar and Pavan have said, is to understand the homogeneous and the robustness and the things that are universal, and then how they're modulated, I think would be a great thing. So it's been a great debate.
My parting comments, Prakash, I think there are two pathways to reinstate the sheen of behavior science. I don't believe, first of all, behavior science has been so detrimentally affected that you know, it's going to fall through the cracks. One pathway, which is already happening, and I can report this from the academic world, is that people are attempting to replicate. They're trying to run the same experiment in different countries. If you want a publication in Nature or Science these days, ideally you would want to run the experiment in half a dozen countries, right? So that's a natural sort of a methodological mechanism by which I think this problem will be weighed down. And the second big hope that I have for behavior science is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in grappling with the heterogeneity that Jez is talking about. So I think exciting. There are going to be exciting times ahead. But the scary thing is, if we are indeed going to be very successful in predicting human behavior, then what does it do to our free will? What does it do to our sense of who we are? If people can tell what we are likely to do in the future. With that, I will pause. Thank you.
Wow, I don't even know how to talk anymore. I think yes, what makes us human is that we don't know. There are times when we're good, there are times when we're just evil. As a society and as individuals, Pavan, thank you so much for helping us end on that note. Pavan, just thank you so much. Fantastic. For everyone around the world who joined in, wear your mask. You know, I'm sure you've got your shots. So you can have your other shots too tonight. It's a weekend. Be safe. Have a good time. Do join next time too.
Such a pleasure. Such a privilege. Thank you.